The following message is a presentation of Ligonier Ministries, home of the radio program Renewing Your Mind with R.C. Sproul.
As we continue now with our study of the Christian and the mind, still want to make some further observations about the significance of the work of Descartes in the 17th century. Again, we make reference to his axiom that he reached after his rigorous process of doubting everything that he could conceivably doubt. He came to the bottom line of his process by saying, I think, therefore I am. And he said that this was an indubitable proposition because of this reasoning, that in order to doubt, I have to be thinking. And in order to be thinking, I have to exist. And if I doubt that I'm thinking, I have to think in order to be doubting. And to doubt that I'm doubting requires that I'm doubting that I'm doubting. So no matter how I slice it, I can't escape the conclusion that I am doubting, and if doubting, thinking, and if thinking, being. Now there's a couple of things I want to say about this as we proceed. I said that he wanted to get down to the bottom line of certainty, where he wasn't assuming anything that couldn't be challenged. And I said, yet, this bottom line, I think, therefore I am, makes two fundamental assumptions that aren't spelled out immediately, or as of yet, in the discussion. For him to be absolutely certain that to think means that he exists, he has to assume two principles, both of which are very closely related to each other. The first one is the law of non-contradiction. Descartes is assuming a rational principle here, a rational law. And the law of non-contradiction, as it is defined historically and technically, is as stated, that A cannot be A and non-A at the same time and in the same relationship. Now, that is to say, a thing or a proposition cannot be what it is and not be what it is at the same time and in the same relationship. We use the symbols A and non-A as a kind of philosophical shorthand here. A person can be A and B at the same time. I can be a father and a son at the same time, but what? Not in the same relationship. Now, the law of non-contradiction is assumed by Descartes when he says, I think, therefore I am, because he's assuming this, that if he is thinking, he is not, at the same time, in the same way, not thinking. You can't think and non-think at the same time and in the same relationship. You cannot doubt and not be doubting at the same time in the same relationship. And so he's assuming the validity of a rational principle or a rational law, a rational form of thinking. That's why we call this a formal principle. Now, the second principle that he's assuming is the law of causality. Because when he says that I think, therefore I am, he's assuming that thought requires a thinker, or that doubt requires a doubter. That is, thought is something that occurs, something that takes place, that requires an antecedent cause for it. Something has to cause that thought. Something has to cause that doubt. And he's saying there that it is his own existence. Now, we may think that Descartes was incredibly naive in the 17th century to assume such a principle as the law of causality, because everybody knows that in the next century, the most comprehensive critique of causality that was ever made in the history of theoretical thought was made by the Scottish philosopher David Hume. And so that people today can rest at ease that we don't any longer have to assume the validity of the law of causality. I remember in a recent book I wrote called Not a Chance, I engaged in a written discussion there, as it were, with people of the past, most notably Bertrand Russell, who, in his book, Why I Am Not a Christian, Professor Russell argued that he was persuaded as a very young man that he couldn't escape the logical necessity of affirming the existence of God, because he figured that if something exists now, something has to cause it, and the old causal argument for the existence of God persuaded Russell as a child that God must necessarily exist. And then, when he was a teenager, he read an essay written by John Stuart Mill, and John Stuart Mill raised this objection to the classic argument for the existence of God. Mill said that that argument rests upon the concept of the law of causality, which law declares that everything must have a cause. But if the law of causality is true, and that everything must have a cause, then manifestly God must have a cause. So there is no rational necessity for deducing the existence of God from the existence of anything else. Because if everything requires a cause, then God would require a cause, and whatever cause God would require a cause, and we would go on ad infinitum, that is, into an infinite regress, which is, again, the argument that Russell used in a more sophisticated form in his debates with later Jesuit apologists. But in any case, what is going on here in this discussion with John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell is one of those cases in history where Homer nodded, where a very brilliant, sophisticated thinker had a muscle cramp, a Charlie horse, in the brain, where he made a very fundamental error. John Stuart Mill made it, and then the error that Mill made was able to persuade Russell when Russell was 18 years old, and Russell never recovered from this erroneous conclusion of his mentor, Mill, and never got over the brain cramp. And the problem is fundamental, it's simple, it's elementary, and that is that they were operating on a false, inaccurate, and invalid definition of the law of causality. The law of causality does not affirm that everything must have a cause. What the law of causality affirms is much more simple than that. It is that every effect must have a cause. Now, do you see the difference? If I say that everything, anything that is, must have a cause, an antecedent cause, then that would apply to God and everything else, and we would be left in this nonsense of infinite regress. But if you say that every effect must have a cause, suddenly the value of the principle of causality seems to be somewhat diminished, because the statement, every effect must have a cause, is what is called a formal truth, or an analytical truth, or, to make it more simple, a statement that is true by definition, true by the sheer power of its internal logic. Because an effect, in order to be an effect, is something that has a cause. That is, the definition of an effect is that which has a cause. And the definition of a cause is that which produces what? An effect. So if there are no effects, there can be no causes. If there are no causes, there can be no effects. However, conversely, if there is an effect, it must have a cause. And if there's a cause, it must yield an effect. An effect without a cause is not an effect. And a cause without an effect is not a cause. An earlier book that I co-authored with Dr. Gerstner and Dr. Lindsley on classical Christian apologetics, in the course of that argument, I was making mention of this business of causality, and in one of the reviews in a technical journal, a Christian philosopher made one objection to my reasoning, and he stated it in writing in the publication, in which he said the problem with Sproul is that Sproul will not allow for an uncaused effect. And I responded to him briefly and saying, "You've got me. I'm trapped. Mea culpa. You're absolutely right. Sproul will not allow for an uncaused effect. But you cite this as a problem. I thought it was a virtue. I was surprised to call it a problem, but what he seemed to suggest was that I am not allowing for something that can actually be an uncaused effect." And I said, "I'm perfectly willing to retreat from my assertion that there's no such thing as an uncaused effect if you can just please give me one example. Anywhere, from anything in nature, from anything in history, give me an example of one single uncaused effect, and I'll abandon the law. I'll abandon the principle." Of course, I'm still waiting for a response, because as soon as he saw what he had said, realized that he went to sleep for a minute, because an uncaused effect is a nonsense statement. It is formally impossible. It is manifestly absurd and illogical. And at that point, when we understand that the law of causality, as properly stated, that for every effect there is an antecedent cause and so on, that law is simply an extension, an application of the earlier law that we've talked about, the law of non-contradiction. Because it rests on the assumption that that which is an effect cannot be an effect and not be an effect at the same time and in the same relationship, and that that which is a cause cannot be a cause and not be a cause at the same time and in the same relationship. Now, after going through all of this, what you may be complaining about now is an Excedrin headache, and you're going to pick up the phone and call me and say, "This I learned about causality today, Dr. Sproul, that you are the immediate cause of my Excedrin headache for getting me lost in all of this." But again, if you can just take your time on this and take a deep breath, we're talking about the bare, bottom line, elementary principles of thinking here, and of knowledge, and of getting intellectual clarity about things. And of course, Descartes didn't labor the point of these assumptions, because he recognized that not only did Descartes assume the validity of the law of non-contradiction in his reasoning process, but he understands, or understood, I should say, that that assumption is a necessary assumption for anybody's thinking about anything in a discursive way. Now let's go back to that law of non-contradiction and see why I said what I just said. Every time I talk about the law of non-contradiction, somebody in the Christian community raises the objection to me, "R.C., aren't you bringing into Christian faith a pagan idea that was invented by Aristotle? Isn't Aristotle the father of the first classic structure of systems of logic? And isn't there a great distance between the thinking of the Jew in the Old Testament and the abstract, logical, relentless, deductive approach to things that we find in classical Greek philosophy? Isn't this just one more example of the intrusion of a pagan idea into Christian thought? And I say, well, I think you're giving Aristotle far too much credit here, and me, conversely, too much blame, because I don't believe for a second that Aristotle invented logic or created logic, any more than I believe that Columbus invented America or created America. What Columbus did was discover something that was already there. And all that Aristotle was trying to do was to give definition to rules of thought that were already built in to rationality, to creatures who have minds. In fact, in Aristotle's own analysis, Aristotle, we know, was a prolific writer, and that he was prodigious in the vastness of the scope of his intellectual pursuits, where he examined arenas of ethics, of aesthetics, of physics, of biology, of philosophy, and a host of other things. And he would distinguish among these pursuits as pursuits among various sciences. But he did not consider logic as a science. Rather, he called logic the organon, O-R-G-A-N-O-N, the organon of all science. Now, the term organon in Greek can be translated by the English word instrument or tool. What he is saying here is that logic is merely a tool that is used by a person who is seeking understanding and knowledge in all these other spheres of endeavor. And he said this for this reason. He said logic is not only a tool or an instrument of thought, but it is a necessary tool for intelligible discourse. That is, logic is necessary for us to be able to speak to one another in an intelligible way. Now, sometimes it's something as simple as this we forget or we get fooled about. I remember teaching a senior class of seminarians in philosophical theology in Philadelphia many years ago. And I was dealing with the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and we were talking about the nature of truth and the nature of propositions and that sort of thing. And I asked my students, I said, what kind of a proposition is this? I held up a piece of chalk and I said, this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk. What have you learned from that? What do I mean when I say this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk? And so I threw that question out to the class, and the student who was the valedictorian of the class said, well, what you mean, Professor, is that that particular piece of chalk that you have in your hand is not really a piece of chalk. And I said, which piece of chalk? And he said, well, the particular piece of chalk that you have in your hand. I said, but that's exactly the particular piece of chalk that I'm talking about. I said, this particular piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk. So then he said, well, I don't know what you mean then. Well, that day, the dean of the institution was visiting the class, and he was sitting there musing, and I said, Dean, can you help us out? The students seem to have run into a roadblock here. They don't understand the significance and the meaning of that statement, this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk. What do I mean by that? And the dean said, well, what you're talking about here has to do with substance and accidents. He said, the old metaphysical problem. You're saying that the piece of chalk that you're holding may have the accidents of chalkiness, but it lacks the substance of chalkiness. And I said, well, I'm not talking about the accidental piece of chalk here. I'm talking about the essential chalk that I have here in my hand is not essential chalkiness. And he said, oh, well then, I don't know. And I said, well, I don't have time here to fool with this all day. Can anybody give me an answer? And I had a student in the class who was the bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church that ministered to people in the inner city. And he was getting more and more disgusted with this discussion and uptight about it. And he was moving all around in his chair. And I said, Bishop Walters, I said, what's your problem with this? And he says, hey, man, he says, I don't learn nothing from that kind of jive. And I stopped right there and I said, thank you, Lord. We have one sentient creature left in this classroom. In other words, this man not only was educated, but this man knew the jive of street talk where people play games with words. And he recognized it for what it was. He said, what you're saying here is a nonsense statement. And I said, that's exactly right. And anybody that was armed with the law of non-contradiction should have recognized it immediately as a violation of the law of non-contradiction and as a nonsense statement. My statement was unintelligible to any rational mind. But you see, my students had more trust in me than to think that I would go up there and deceive them with this kind of stuff. And so they were looking for something more profound, something deeper and deeper. When what I was trying to get them to learn was, no matter how many degrees you have after your name, a contradiction is still a contradiction, and it's a nonsense statement, and no matter how much education you have, you don't have the authority to carry the day with nonsense statements. And that's part and parcel of what Descartes was trying to get at. Now, in our next session, we're going to see how this all fits together with respect to Descartes' concern to argue for the reality of God. We do like it when you call us at Ligonier, and we have a whole tape series on Christians' use of logic and how logic interacts with Christian theology and so on. And I hope you will avail yourselves of that sort of material that we offer. But please, if you have a headache today, just take an aspirin and call me in the morning and accept my apologies. This stuff can sound so difficult and so abstract, and yet all that we're talking about here are the very root basics of thinking and of speaking in a manner that you and I, as we talk together, can have a meaningful discussion. where the statements that I make can be understood by you, and the statements that you make can be understood by me. I know it can sound very, very abstract, but so often where we get off base in our thinking, in our philosophy, in our theology, is at the very beginning, on the very basic foundational issues of knowledge. And from time to time, we need to go back to the basics, back to what we would call the foundational principles of truth. And that's what we're trying to do in these days.
For more information about Ligonier Ministries, call 1-800-435-4343 or contact us on the web at ligonier.org. That's ligonier.org. Or write P.O. Box 54 7500, Orlando, Florida 32854.